Okay, thanks everyone for coming back. If you've been looking at the program, you might have expected to see Erik Lidman here, but Erik called in sick. So I'm slightly less Swedish and slightly less great than Erik, but fortunately we have a fantastic session with two papers on ESG and executive pay. So without further ado, we have Adam Badawi of UC Berkeley to present the first paper that he wrote with Bobby from Stanford Law. Adam, please.
Thank you. As Roy said, this is joint work with Bobby. We began this project when we were both colleagues together at Berkeley Law. Bobby has moved on to a place that will have its endowment taxed in short order. And I will also note that I get to control the color scheme. So, okay, so we're looking at ESG-based compensation, which was a phenomenon that is relatively pervasive among law firms, less so in smaller firms, but it's also something that we see in the EU as well. There's been a fair bit of research on the practice, kind of showing that it is in fact something that is used quite often. The hole in the literature that we're seeking to fill here is that there hadn't been a lot of work on do people actually hit the targets, I think one of the reasons why is because it was hard to collect that information. You have to go through each of the proxy statements. There's no structured way of presenting that information. You have to actually read it and figure out what happened, and then the way they present it varies quite highly from firm to firm. Okay, so what's the theory behind this? Why would you link executive compensation to ESG performance? One theory is that there are investors out there who want to see this, right? Who want to see both the practice of linking the compensation, but ultimately with the hope that it will lead to better ESG performance. And then there's another theory that this is kind of one of the ways that executives can kind of pad their pay or engage in greenwashing or something along those lines. And it's hard to sort out which one might be at work here, but we have a little bit of evidence that we'll share with you. And then one other concern, I think, is that also it's a little bit odd for firms to say kind of, we incentivize ESG and our executives appear not to care about it because they missed all of their targets, right? So I think that there's potentially a PR argument going on as well. So this may be known to some of you, but I'll give you just a brief primer on executive compensation and how it tends to work. It usually has three components. One is salary, one is an annual bonus, and another one is long-term incentive compensation, which is usually stock options or restricted stock or options or some combination thereof. And at least in our sample, which is going to be the S&P 500, and this is true across the board, it's heavily weighted towards the long-term incentive plan, right? So it's 10% is roughly salary, 18% bonus, and 72% in the long-term incentive plan. And what the previous research has shown is that most of the ESG-linked compensation is in the annual bonus, right? So that automatically tells us this is not a huge part of your compensation, right? This is something, I wouldn't quite call it window dressing, but it's not a massive part of it, although we do see that it is, at least kind of when we look at it, seeping into the long-term incentive compensation in some industries, kind of largely utilities, kind of the ones that are where sustainability is a large concern. Okay, so let's look at the bonus because that's where we're going to be focused on looking at the ESG-linked compensation. And the way this typically works is that you'll have multiple components, right? And so we'll often observe for firms that have ESG-linked compensation, they'll have ESG, kind of an ESG component to the bonus, and then a financial component to the bonus, and there'll be multiple pieces sometimes within each of those, right? So in the financial component, you might have a revenue goal, and you might have an EBITDA goal, and the way that it's going to be set is that there will be some sort of threshold. You need to get to this level to get any sort of bonus associated with this. There's a target, and then there's a maximum. And the way it typically works is that wherever you hit, your bonus will be tied to that. So if you get 100% of your revenue goal, right, that's hitting the target. So you will get 100% of whatever amount was targeted for that. The threshold might be 75%, so as long as you hit 75%, you'll get a bonus, but it'll only be 75% of the target. And then the maximum might be 150%, so if you get 150%, you'll get 1.5 of whatever the target bonus was going to be, okay? So we look at just 1 year worth of proxies, 2023. And when you look at these proxies, what you typically see reported are the compensation structures for the top 5 executives. And it's both looking forward, here's what we're going to give them in the year that's coming, and also looking backwards, here's what they earned last year as well. And that's where we're getting the information on the ESG-linked compensation. Okay, so this was quite a tedious task. We tried one team of research assistants who did okay, then we tried ChatGPT, which did okay, and then we had another team of research assistants that did better, and then we had to read it ourselves to really be confident that we were getting all of this. Okay, so we code the information on financial targets and ESG targets, and that's what we'll share with you now. Okay, so of the S&P 500, 63% are using some sort of ESG-linked measure, right? So this is a pervasive practice, at least among the larger firms. And 304 of those are incorporating it into the annual bonus. Okay, so again, that's really where the action is with respect to ESG-linked compensation. If you kind of want to figure out how much of this of the bonus is linked to ESG, it averages about 15%, and how much of the overall compensation, it's only about 3% of your overall compensation is linked to ESG, right? Because it's only part of the bonus. The bonus is only a small part of the compensation, and so it ends up being about 3%. As I said, we're seeing it seep into the long-term incentive performance plans. So we had 48 of the firms, so almost 10% are using it there. And when you use that, it's going to account for a larger part of the overall compensation because that's a larger piece of that compensation package. So that gets you to about 7% for those firms of the CEO's compensation is linked to some sort of ESG performance. Okay, and part of reading through these proxies is you learn sometimes they tell you what the targets are going to be, and sometimes they don't tell you what the targets are. And so for financial ones, they usually tell you what the target is, and it's quite easy to figure out if they've actually hit the target. With the ESG targets, less so. Sometimes they'll tell you this is what our diversity goal was, or this is what our emissions goal was, and here's whether or not we hit it. And sometimes they'll just tell you we had an emissions goal, right? Or we wanted to see a certain trend when it came to diversity, but we're not going to give you the exact numbers. And we'll show you that kind of whether or not you provide a quantitative target appears to affect whether or not you hit those targets. So, so of the 304 with an ESG-linked bonus, we can classify 247 of them, whether or not they kind of hit them, met them, exceeded them, or missed, met, or exceeded them is the way we categorized them. And then we essentially created all the categories that were possible. So of all your ESG targets, you could have hit all of them, you could have missed all of them, you could have met some of them, missed some of them, and so on. And so if you want to see our results in one slide, this is basically it. Okay, so this is the ESG performance over here. And so if you look at the firms and you want to know how many of them missed all of their ESG targets, the number is 6 of the firms missed all of their ESG targets. Okay, so that's really the main takeaway from our paper is that basically everyone is hitting at least one of these ESG targets, which is quite different than the financial targets, right? So 107 of the firms here, and notice that the denominator is different, right? We have more information about the financial targets than we do about the ESG targets, but you can see that this one is substantially larger, right? The financial targets appear to be hard targets that are difficult to hit, and some people aren't hitting them, whereas these appear to be softer, right? Kind of almost everyone is getting them. As we put it in the paper, it looks like this might be what we call a participation trophy, right? So everyone gets a trophy for their ESG performance. Now, a comment we've gotten, which is fair, is there's usually more ESG targets than there are financial targets, right? So if this is just random, right, it would be, and if there's 5 ESG targets in your plan and it's random, it would be hard to miss all of them, right? So that's something that might be a concern. But if we do this in a different way, we see that this appears to be something that's actually real. So this is, the blue ones are for ESG. Did you exceed or meet all of them, right? A strong majority is exceeding or meeting all of their ESG targets. And this is the percentage that are missing just one of their ESG targets. And that's relatively low, which if you had kind of 5 targets and it was random, you'd expect that number to be relatively high. Okay, so in terms of just putting this into print, for financial targets, 22% are missing all of their targets. When it comes to ESG targets, 2% are missing all of their targets. So we're seeing quite a difference there. I think I'm getting a little bit pinched on time, so I'll try and get to some of this question about, is this producing better ESG performance? Okay, so what we're going to do here, so this is something that's relatively difficult to do, but we're going to look at your ESG score and how that correlates with, do you have an ESG target, is the first column. Did you meet or exceed all of your ESG targets, and did you meet or exceed all of your financial targets? And we see that just having a target is associated with higher ESG scores, but meeting or exceeding your targets is not associated with higher ESG scores, right? So this is consistent with the notion that this is actually not producing stronger ESG performance, right? Again, these are correlational, so we don't want to put too much weight on that, but we could also point out that when we look at say on pay votes against, right, that if you're meeting or exceeding, you have a higher share of against votes here. Now, there's some thoughts that that's really a measure of financial performance rather than anything about governance, but I'm happy to discuss that when we get to questions. Okay, and then we also kind of look to see if there's an increase kind of year over year where we control for your 2021 score. And again, we see most of the action is just with, do you have an ESG target, right? That is associated with higher scores. But do you meet your targets? That is generally not associated with higher ESG scores. Okay, so let me just say something briefly about transparent versus non-transparent targets. As I said before, sometimes they will say, this is our emissions target, or this is our diversity target, and either you hit it or you didn't quantitatively. And sometimes they'll just say, we want to see trends in the right direction, or in the worst case scenarios, it's the compensation committee is going to go into a room and ask, does Bobby care about sustainability? And they're like, well, I saw him use the compost bin once, right? So you should get your ESG bonus, right? It's really, some of them really are that soft, right? It's up to the discretion of the compensation committee. Okay, so there's prior work just on the financial metrics saying that if you have transparent targets, they're harder to hit versus non-transparent ones. I think that's quite intuitive, but we can even see that in the ESG measures. So this is Salesforce. And Salesforce, here they said, we want 47.5% of our employees to identify as these particular groups, right? So that's a hard target that you're either going to hit or you're not going to hit. Versus this is Mondelez, which makes Oreos. And here they say, with our colleagues, right, sustained year over year progress, right? So again, kind of softer, not telling you exactly what the standard is. I would also point out that you get rewarded at Mondelez if you promote mindful snacking, right? I don't know how you promote mindful snacking and how that's different from snack leadership, right? But these are the things that can produce higher bonuses along these ways. But notice they did well on the colleagues, but less so on the mindful snacking. Okay, all right, and so when we look at these different sorts of targets within the different groups within ESG, we see that DEI, where we tend to see more quantitative sorts of targets, Those tend to be missed more often. Safety, you have to report those numbers to OSHA every year, so it's relatively easy. OSHA is our safety regulator in the US. Those tend to be harder to hit. And so this is kind of mild evidence that where it's easier to quantify a target, you're less likely to hit it, and where we have some of the softer ones, we tend not to hit it. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so let me just wrap up, right? We see a relatively extensive use of this. There's some indications that this is being cut back in the current environment, although the precise numbers remain to be seen. While it's low compensation, it gets hit at a very high level. And we don't see evidence that this is actually increasing ESG performance. It might be associated more with poor governance or greenwashing. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Adam. That was great. And now we have a discussant, Anna Albuquerque from Boston University. Anna, please.
Test. Oh, yes. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Albuquerque. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. So Adam did a great job, so I will just quickly summarize some of the results and tell you what I think are the strengths of the paper. So the paper finds that 63% of S&P 500 firms in 2023 include ESG metrics in their executive pay packages, which is a really high number compared to the previous years. ESG targets are usually easily achieved compared to the non-ESG performance metrics. They are usually met, but there is no improvement in ESG scores, or so it does not translate into higher ESG outputs. And the authors find that meeting the ESG targets is usually associated with weak corporate governance. What I think are the strengths of the paper, I loved it that it's hand-collected. This is very, very, very messy data, unstructured data, and the authors did a great job at translating what it's really unstructured and messy into something that could be analyzed to get some novel insights. I also loved it that they used ChatGPT to kind of see whether they did a good job or not, and actually they find that in some cases they did not, and so they went back and corrected. So I thought that was very interesting. And the paper has policy implications for the need for more disclosure on ESG targeting. So my comments are basically on the motivation, research design, and then some on the contribution. So on the motivation, this was supposed to have to not show everything at once, but I sent the PDF file, so I forgot. But anyhow, it doesn't matter. So the authors have basically two different theories, right? The first theory is that, well, maybe the ESG performance targets are going to allow the boards and executives to increase ESG output. Okay, so that's kind of one theory. It's a good one. The second one, it's a bad theory in the sense that, well, maybe the usage of ESG metrics basically is just a way to greenwash, as Adam said, or is basically a way to rent extract, where you are using these ESG metrics to provide some extra income to executives, because usually these are very easy to achieve and they are non-transparent. Okay, so you have these two different theories. So I was thinking about these and thinking, are there any other reasons why we could see these results? And one thing that occurred to me, well, maybe the reason why we observe that companies tend to easily meet ESG performance targets, it's because executives have better control over those targets. So if my objective is to increase diversity and the number of female workers in the workplace, I can just hire more women, right? And I have control over that. It's much harder for me to basically increase my relative TSR, so total shareholder return, right? Because I don't control the stock market. But I know how many, I can control how many people I hire that are majority of color and so on. So that's one alternative hypothesis. The other one is that maybe even though, as the authors mentioned, even though the impact on pay of meeting those ESG targets is very small. Maybe there are non-compensation costs associated with non-meeting the ESG targets, right? So if I am Shell and there is a big oil spill, right, because I did not invest in preventing that environmental disaster, then maybe the consequences are very high for executives. So I'm going to be very careful in trying to take actions to avoid that occurs. So maybe, just thinking a little bit more about these alternative explanations could add to the paper. In terms of the research design, so I'm going to focus on the two equations that the paper has. One is looking at adopting ESG performance metrics or meeting or beating those performance metrics, and that's regressed on proxies for weak governance, and I will talk a little bit more about that, as well as this ESG score. And I was a little bit confused about this test just because the ESG score is measured at T-1. So basically saying that for companies that they have invested in the past in ESG, are they more likely to having performance metrics linked to ESG, or are they more likely to meet or beat those? And so I was, in terms of trying to link that to testing the theories, I find it challenging. And so one thing that I thought is, maybe you have to really kind of disentangle that regression and analyze the dependent variables separately, because there are, I can think about if I am interested in analyzing or studying what leads companies to include ESG performance metrics in their pay, maybe, looking at what the peers are doing is relevant, right? Because companies kind of tend to mimic each other. So looking at the peers, looking at shareholder proposals on ESG, maybe if there are more shareholder proposals, companies are also more likely to adopt that. Are there violations associated with ESG metrics? And if I'm looking at how likely are companies to meet or beat, maybe I also should control for firm performance. Maybe firms that are more profitable, I know you control for size, which is very important, but maybe companies that are more profitable, they also have the resources to invest more on meeting or beating the target. So just some thoughts. Another thing that I thought, my third bullet point here, is that you have this great data that no one has, right? Specifics about the targets. And you also know whether the targets are qualitative or quantitative. So could it be that companies are, that weak corporate governance companies are more likely to achieve the qualitative targets because they are non-transparent and hard to measure, but they are less likely to meet the quantitative targets, which are transparent. So it would just allow you to dig a little bit deeper into your research question. And then, looking at ESG score at T-1, I was thinking, well, maybe that is a function of the performance last year. So could you just look at the ones that initiated having ESG metrics? And then just going a little bit deeper into the results, one thing that I noticed here that struck me, it was that the fact that the CEO variable is a fraction of the company's voting power held by the firm's CEO. So what's going to happen is that for the large firms, that fraction is going to be smaller. So maybe that explains your negative coefficient there. So you can just use, some other corporate governance measures or proxies like, co-opt, CEO tenure, CEO duality, and a bunch of others. Another thing that it's interesting is that looking at this is against say on pay. And so what you find is that shareholders approve companies that include ESG metrics, but they disapprove companies that meet those targets. So what would they approve? Companies that do not meet the targets? So it's, I'm left with, how should I interpret these results? I know that the way you interpret is that, well, the ones that do not approve the companies that meet the targets, what the paper is saying is because we know that those targets are very easy to meet and they are obscure, so it's just a sign of excess pay, right? But it could also be that the negative say on pay is just a reaction to another pay component, right? So it would be nice if you could just identify whether they are really reacting to ESG. Then in this test, which is very nice. You are basically looking at, well, if you indeed have ESG performance metrics or meet or beat the performance metrics, does it result in output, higher output? Very important. A couple of comments here. The first one is that you control for 2021 score. I'm sure you have a reason for that, but it's not in the paper. And could you just look at the change in the score, right? What is the impact of having ESG performance metrics in the pay packages on the score? I also thought that maybe you could take advantage of all the great data that you have and look at whether the interaction of having an ESG performance metric on the output is different for firms that have strong corporate governance versus the ones that do not. And also for companies that have quantitative measures versus qualitative measures, because you would expect the impact to be different. I also thought you only look at those scores, those ESG scores. Could you also look at other benefits, right? If you are doing great in ESG, do customers appreciate that? And because of that, your sales go up? Or do you have less likelihood of violations? And I am told, I haven't worked in this area, but I am told that MSCI scores are actually very good, and it's a data that is widely used. And because you don't find any results on the Sustainalytics, maybe you can use that other score instead. Contribution, I think the paper uses very detailed ESG performance metrics to provide insights into an area that is understudied. The paper finds results that are actually different from Cohen and al. So it would be nice to mention that. You do reference that paper. And also there is another paper by Franco, Imperatori, and Ivanova, where they look at instances of firms that have ESG violations, whether those firms increase or use ESG metrics. I think it doesn't take away anything from your paper, but maybe just a paper that you can also reference. I have a bunch of other things, but I will talk to you afterwards. So I greatly enjoyed reading the paper. My suggestions are hopefully just to help you improve the insights of the paper, and I wish you best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Adam, do you want to respond quickly while we gather questions from the audience?
Sure. So this is a very rich set of comments, so I don't think I can respond to all of them, but let me just highlight a couple points. We've heard the comment on this might be something you can control, and I think that's potentially true. And I think and to unite it to one of your other comments, the one related to say on pay, right? So sometimes people think say on pay is just a measure of financial performance, right? If you're performing poorly, you're going to have lower say on pay votes, right? And so in that situation where you know you're not going to hit your financial targets, it might be a situation where, oh, I can control my ESG bonus. I might do that. And then we also had conversations with financial pay consultants, and one of them actually said, well, you know, if you have these softer targets and they're going to miss their financial targets, you can use it to kind of help soften the blow of missing all of your financial targets. So I think that there's a mix of things going on there, but I think that's part of the dynamic that's potentially at play.
Okay, so we have a healthy 7 people queue, and they want to hit our target. So let's start with Jill.
So great paper. I struggled in the paper to figure out exactly how you were defining ESG, and I thought about Elizabeth's, of course, great paper on the topic, but given that you had this distinction between sort of objective and subjective ESG, I thought ESG where there's a plausible financial story as opposed to ESG that seems to be more values or socially oriented might be a useful cut. So, you know, when you think about things like plant explosions or oil spills, right? You know, yeah, you can call that ESG, but it seems pretty clearly tied to the company's profitability, operating performance, regulatory risk, and so forth. And it, you know, at least right now, and again, sort of maybe borrowing from our colleague John Click's work, some of the diversity targets, I think it's a harder case to say, yes, there's a clear link to financial performance. So just maybe something to think about, and also a little more transparency into the way you kind of set that up. Now, I know firms do some of that in the way they disclose this, but I don't know that we have to take that at face value.
Adam, they want to take like 3 people packages.
Sure,
and
yeah.
right, Tobias.
I'm quite sure you have heard this comment before, but I would strongly encourage you to disentangle E, S, and G, simply because I think it means all sorts of things. And what that gives you, you can also do that for the ESG scores, because all these ratings give you the individual components, and that could give you a better idea what's going on. Plus, last thing, you also open up to other output variables, particularly in the E space, because then you can use emissions and look, does it really have a real world impact? And I think that's something that could be valuable for the project.
All right, Ellen, and then we stop for comments.
Thank you. I think you might have some circular measures in here that I think can be disentangled, but for example, I believe most of the indicators in ESG ratings are reporting or disclosure based. And those are actually weakly negatively correlated with environmental performance, at least for the E. And actually, I think some of them even have ESG remuneration in the ratings. So like you're actually just measuring the same thing. What might be a good idea is actually just to look at scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions, just to spot check the E. But I would just make sure to include acquisitions and disposals.
Right. You want to stop for comments?
So on Jill's point, I mean, at a broad level, I mean, kind of ESG is a kind of crammed together concept in the beginning, and so it doesn't do a great job of disentangling what you want, which are kind of good measures of financial performance, or things that are likely to be correlated with financial performance, and things that aren't. I think our strategy generally was to just, if the firm was saying that they were rewarding ESG, to just take them at their word, and this is something that applies generally to the comments. It's hard. They don't always disentangle all of the stuff. It's quite vague in a lot of ways. So they might just say, they might group all of that together in a single measure, which makes it hard for us to pull it apart. And I think we have long text threads on whether or not safety should count as ESG. We ultimately did count it, but I agree that it is certainly more likely to be related to financial performance than some of these other ones. Tobias, we have gotten that comment before, and I would respond in somewhat the same way, which is a lot of times in their reporting, they're pushing these things together in a way that makes it difficult. You know, they might say, we have an ESG bonus, and 35% of it was E, and 20% was S, or you know what it might be, but we don't get the detail within that, and so that was part of the compromise that we had to make. We definitely have the concern that this is circular, right? That we're just measuring, oh, hey, you include it. There's more opacity than we would like about how these scores are calculated. As part of why we're trying to get multiple metrics. It sounds like there's another one that we could use as well. But insofar as we can identify those ones, perhaps we can push those to the side. And then I would say the same thing with emissions. I fully agree that would be great to tease apart, but we don't always get that detail given the unstructured nature.
Great. So next triplet, Erik.
Yeah, just real quick. One thing that kind of struck me, and you didn't mention in the presentation, but I'd be interested in trying to figure out whether there might be a tax angle going on here. So this would be a type of performance-based compensation. It would fall under Section 162M. That gives some deductibility for performance-based compensation. Before 2018, I would have sworn this is a tax issue, right? Because it was almost unlimited deductibility. That's more limited now after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but it's still kind of hard, for a lot of issues, it's hard to predict like whether those limits are gonna bind or not. So why not have some squishy, even the more qualitative the better way to just, you know, like get to the deduction limit using an ESG threshold. And I wonder whether there's ways that you can sort of tease that out, right? For companies that, it's at least plausibly likely that they're not gonna hit the full deductibility on financial or options. And then did you see any evidence of like repricing of the ESG? I don't know whether you would since you're taking a snapshot, but it might be disclosed at least retroactively in the 10K. Yeah.
Thank you. Then Daniel, right beside you.
So I just want to echo one comment that Anna made about control, and just to rephrase it in a different way, if you have a very tight link between inputs and outputs in the sense that there's not a lot of randomness from the input to the outputs, then really the optimal target has to look like a soft target exposed, because you're not going to set something that no one is going to achieve. So maybe what looks like a soft target exposed, it may actually not be a soft target. It's just that there's not as much randomness before. And in this context, to give a different example, in the case of outside directors, for example, they receive fees for attending meetings, right? And these are like actually quite small fees, and say, why does that happen? And you see that attendance is actually close to 100%. So it looks like, they are giving so they are being compensated to attend meetings, and they essentially attend all meetings. But there's actually some evidence that the small variation you have in these meeting fees actually affect their behavior. So I think it's a similar thing that could be going on here, right? So if we know that, we want to achieve these particular targets, and there's not much volatility from inputs to outputs, then you will want to set a target that looks soft exposed, even if it is not. So maybe it's just something about interpretation of your results.
Thank you. Last one in that bench, Adriana.
Thanks. So I think I'm going to suggest another project, a follow-on project, which is that you could use your data for. So we were talking earlier about there's lots and lots of companies that have stopped making diversity and other types of disclosures this year relative to last year, very sort of sharp, but not all. So I think of those as being sort of like formerly reluctant compliers who have revealed themselves to be reluctant because the moment they could stop, they did. And I would be really interested to see how, if you split out your results by the sort of reluctant compliers and the less reluctant compliers, what that would look like.
Erik, on the tax stuff, so we did get comments from an exec comp lawyer saying that you definitely will not see qualitative measures in the long-term compensation because that's going to get you into trouble. So, and this is borne out in the data. The only thing that you will see are kind of hard targets for long-term incentive compensation, and it tends to be in the utilities space. So it could be that I don't know the tax law details.
So the American Rescue Plan in 2021, which I only looked up while I was thinking of this question, gives you more wiggle room on quality. So it might be worth it.
Okay. So, and then on the repricing, if we collect this data again, which I'm not sure that we're going to do, we could look at the repricing as well. On the soft targets, that could be the case. Again, we just don't get enough detail for us to be able to figure out whether or not it's going on, or if they're getting signals in advance, like, oh, you've hit the threshold or something along those lines. And Audrey, I would love to be able to kind of, again, collect the data again and see.
You don't have to. You can expose. You know they were reluctant then because they stopped as soon as they could stop.
We would need another year of data to figure out if they stopped.
No, but we can talk later.
Okay.
You don't actually. We know they stopped disclosing.
If there's a nice list of the ones who stopped disclosing, then that's a good place to start.
All right, great. Last triplet, Jeff.
So this is, I guess, a follow-on to suggesting a follow-on, right? Which is, you've got this great collection of firms and data, and there's been an exogenous shock. And boy, there's, I hope you'll get your RAs to start again, right? Because it would be, having seen firms responding in one environment, to see how firms change their response in a different environment, and which firms, and et cetera, et cetera. This is, regrettably, you've got a terrific natural experiment here. And so I hope you won't miss the opportunity to sort of, you or your RAs or postdocs to follow up on it.
Yeah, there's been some people have collected information from the new proxies to at least see who's reporting and who's stopped reporting as well. But I agree in theory that, I hope you picked up that we had RAs, but it was mostly us. But yes, I agree, yeah.
All right, so we have Marco and then, we have Jennifer.
Thanks, I found that fascinating. Just a a sort of comparative comment. Your comments about the soft versus the hard targets really made me realise what a regulatory ecosystem this is, and the extent to which the institutional investors are a sword of Damocles. Because in Australia, the top companies listed on the Australian Securities Exchange, 93% of them have ESG targets. I think they're more in the long term than you're talking about in the US context. But interestingly enough, Australian institutional investors have a lot of power under the Say on Pay, because if you get 2 negative votes 2 years in a row, they're allowed to have a resolution to spill the entire board. So it's a really, really powerful, disincentive to, not be listening to the shareholders. And back in 2016, the Commonwealth Bank tried to put in place a very soft target where their CEO was rewarded for being kind to people and community. And the institutional investors just went crazy. And so I would be really interested to see the extent to which the soft versus hard targets in Australia, and I don't know what it is, but I think that companies would be too fearful to have super soft targets.
The one thing I would note is that the shift that we've had in the U.S. is not just among the administration, it also appears to be among the institutional investors as well, who I think are a part of the reason why you've seen some backing away from it. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.